What's up, fam? It's your boy Demuir here, purveyor of all sounds underground. Thank you for joining me on my YouTube channel today, where I'll be discussing the topic of key mixing techniques that have absolutely saved my life and my music in some instances. But what I need from you is that SLC before I jump into things. Hit subscribe, like, comment, and more importantly, hit the notifications bell to stay in touch with the new videos that we have up and coming. We post every Tuesday and Thursday, and a number of you haven't hit the subscribe button, so not sure what's up with that, but nice to see you again. All right, so key mixing things that have absolutely saved my life. I can tell you one of the things that I learned very early on, and it's not necessarily a tip, it's just more of a known thing that I don't think a lot of people put emphasis on, which is your monitoring situation. I've learned over the years that it is a huge part of getting the best out of your mix. You know, sounds are important, recordings are important, but you know, in terms of your monitoring situation, it's really a make or break deal. I'm on the Focal Alpha 80s right now, and in my opinion, they're a huge step up from the Yamaha HS 8s that I had before, which were also a great set of monitors for its time. But to get to that professional level and to hear things with more clarity and understanding that will ultimately influence your mixing decisions, I think is a really huge step. So that is right off the bat one of the most important things. Okay, so point number one. I learned this early in my career when I was producing underground hip-hop with my main man DJ Attic out in Brampton, and we were doing our thing. And I smile about this story because I was lucky to have this engineer that we were working with, this dude named Gadget, and Gadget has since gone on to do tremendous things with Drake's OVO camp, and he is huge in terms of influencing decisions on mixes and engineering sessions. He works very closely with the team. You don't hear a lot about him, you don't see him too often, but this guy is the real deal. And one of the things he said was, make sure y'all always have quality sounds. The example he gave me was I had a snare loaded up on my old Ensoniq ASR 10, and he was like, that snare is okay, the one I sampled, but he's like, this one is better. And it was the stock snare sound that came on one of the discs, and he showed me ways to combine it, layer it, and EQ it. Just really invaluable techniques I still hold on to this day. That's why I talk a lot about different techniques when you're sampling stuff. Don't necessarily sample the stuff that's online, it's compressed, there's not much to pull from. Try and grab it from vinyl if you can. And if you got to go with the compressed stuff, make sure you EQ it properly to get the most transients and dynamics out of it as much as possible. So quality sounds is job number one in this. And point number two, you want to save time. So one of the biggest ways I was able to do this, and if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my video on how to build a quality template for your DAW for underground electronic music. Having a consistent template helps tremendously in terms of saving time and ultimately air fatigue. I mix as I go along, just going with intuition in terms of what I should do in terms of balancing sounds, frequencies to cut or boost at certain rates. But you want to make sure you're saving time and not spending endless amounts of time on that little tiny shaker that's going on in the background and figuring out how to EQ or in some cases compress it. It just doesn't make sense. You know, make sure you're working with air fatigue and being mindful of that, and saving time is a key element in that. And point number three is to focus on the key elements in a track. Let's have a look at my screen and I'll show you a little bit more of what I'm talking about. This should sound familiar to you guys. This is the introduction song to our videos. It's called Pretty Looks. Right. So the reason why I was playing that piece is just to show you the elements in here in terms of what I felt they were when I was mixing this at the time. It's now almost 2.5 years ago since this came out. I focused heavily on the vocal piece, which is one part right here.
Look pretty for the picture, Connie.
The kick. And the main loop, of course. Filter down there. And this crazy sound I got off my Moog Sub 37. It just rocked. And then, of course, you know, all the other little beats in the mix here. You know, all of these made up a groove. So I knew those were the foundational items. I can go into other pieces like the snare and stuff, but for me, you want to make sure as you're mixing in the process that you're focusing on these key elements that make up the complete track and the overall picture of the mix. And point number 4, you've heard me say this in a number of my other videos, which is to ensure that everything in the mix has its place. And what I mean by that, I'm speaking specifically to the frequency spectrum. I'm talking about making sure vocals are not colliding and conflicting too much with other signals in the same area of like 500 hertz, you know, and that easily happens if you throw a couple of lush pads, and depending on how long it's going on for, you have an immediate conflict. But with careful EQing and you know, very specific outcomes that you're looking for in terms of your mix, you can easily balance the two as you're going along in the process. But making sure things have its place, like drums and bass are right down the center from a mono perspective, and then you have other light elements like shakers or open hats that are in the stereo spectrum. It's important that you make sure things are easily distinguishable by having their own place in the mix. Point number 5, it's easy to use the solo button, and I say make sure you're not using it that often, with the exception of instances where you need to get surgical, like there's an annoying noise somewhere and you're trying to figure out if you need to use some dynamic EQing, so you might have to solo something out and do a sweep. Some other guys say, you know, just push the sound up by 5 to 10 dB if you have to, and then EQ accordingly, and then just bring the sound down once you're ready to go ahead and see how it sits in a mix. I think either technique will work, but the whole point here is to not sit on the solo button to make very impactful mixing decisions that will basically hurt the entire mix if you're not careful with how you use it. And point number 6 is to mix with purpose and intent. And it's kind of hinting to this with the, you know, the point on everything having its place in the, you know, the frequency of the mix. But let me show you my screen again in terms of what I'm talking about specifically. I'm going to use the kick as an example here. So let's dive into my kick, solo this out. And interesting, at the time I didn't have the Pultec. I use the Pultec most of the time on my kicks and snares now, but here's the example I'm gonna show. Depending on the kick, sometimes I would make that conscious decision to go into my mix, and let's pull up the kick here, play it, and I'd say, okay, great, I'm gonna do a bump here on, and this is crazy that this isn't gain stage, but it probably worked this way because I'm not using the Pultec, which it forced me to gain stage, but I don't want to digress. So depending on the desk you're using, I might want to put a bump here, not there, in this range at 60 hertz, well actually around the 220 area, so anywhere between 220 200, sorry, and 250 hertz if I wanted a bit more attack. I'm exaggerating it here just to underscore the point, but that's where I would do it. And that's an example of mixing with a very specific intent and purpose. I want to put some punch and attack into that kick, so I'm going to go in and push it there, and then I'm going to come back and see how it sits in the overall mix. I wouldn't normally solo it out like that. I just did it for demonstrative purposes here to make sure you can hear a bit of the changes I was making. But I would do it while, you know, everything is playing, just to see if I'm getting what I expect. So that's mixing with purpose. All right, and point number 7, I hinted at this in the last point, which is to ensure you're getting what you expect. So it's the constant monitoring and checking back and forth. If you do need to solo very briefly to validate something and then come back. But most of the time, you want to make sure that when you've mixed with a purpose and intent, you're making sure that you are getting what you're expecting out of that mixing decision. And point number 8 is to ensure you're mixing in mono. I've made other videos on this one, and it's super important for the style of music we're making, which is underground electronic dance music. Mono is key because that's what club systems are. They're in mono. So if you could get things sounding great from a mono perspective, you are all set. So if you look at my screen, the way I achieved this is by leveraging this plugin here. It's a stock plugin in Logic. I think most DAWs should have this, that allow you to flip in between the mono signal and stereo. So if you listen here, I know this track, I mixed most of it in mono. You know, I made sure vocals were straight down the line, and you could see, let me stop this. You could see here in Logic, the kick is in mono. We have another beat break that's in mono. I think this is, where's the vocal? The vocal here is in mono, and I can tell because I generally use this compressor, the Neve 33609, on vocals for speech. You know, so mixing in mono or being able to check how things sound in mono is absolutely critical because you're mixing for the club in this instance. So it's a simple check to be able to flip back and forth, but I would actually suggest, you know, for most of your mixing process, that you're just leaving the mono button engaged, and as you're getting towards the end of mixing things, check it in stereo. You know, that would be my suggestion, because you're forcing yourself to ensure that it sounds as best as possible in mono. And the other advantage of mono is that you pretty much hear everything out of your sounds and the quality of those specific sounds. So heavily suggest that you mix in mono. Point number 9 is to ensure that you're mixing with a sub and make sure that sub is on. I say that for electronic dance music because you cannot mix what you cannot hear. And being able to hear what the sub frequencies are doing are vitally important to being able to produce better mixes. I never used to mix with a sub all the time, but you know, it absolutely changed my life, and I can't imagine not mixing, you know, or not hearing the sub frequencies while I was going through the mixing process. So definitely want to make sure you're mixing with a sub. And point number 10, I stayed away from this for a while, as I've said in my previous videos, until, you know, I moved here, got proper acoustic treatment in my room, and the whole thing about using sound correction was a bit new to me, but it's been saving my life and mixes for a while now. The ability to ensure that I'm getting what I expect out of a mix in this particular room has been an absolute lifesaver, and I heavily recommend it to you. In absence of a tool like SonarWorks, I used to use just like a very small Bluetooth speaker as one of the key reference places where I go to review my mixes, and in the car as well. The thought process is if it sounds great on a crummy set of speakers because they're so tiny and small, if you can hear pretty much everything on it, you are good to go with that mix. And point number 11, I learned this from Chris Lord Angel, and he's a wonderful engineer for a number of rock bands. And one of the things he said is to mix at super low levels. I would say as a starting recommendation is to try and mix at a conversation level, which is anywhere between 60 and 65 dBs in particular. It will save your ears, and it also forces you to critique the mix. Like, are you hearing things as they're supposed to be heard? Because in my opinion, if you got to turn it up to sort of catch a vibe off of the tune that you're working on, then it's whack to begin with. So try and mix at a conversation level most of the time, and you'll be good. You'll see a rapid improvement in your mixes. And the last point is point number 12, which is to simply be able to step away from what you're doing in the mix, whether it's taking short breaks to avoid ear fatigue, or what I tend to do most of the time is I'll work through the mix for a couple of hours and then I shut it down and then revisit it a couple of days later before I'm ready to finalize things. It allows you to save your ears from fatigue. It's always good to come back with a great set of fresh ears, and you'll hear things that you just didn't hear before because you've just been spending so much time on the mix. So highly recommend stepping away at brief intervals, and I would highly recommend if it's a couple of days, even better. Just proactively plan, and you should do well in terms of being able to finalize mixes and pre-masters on a regular and consistent basis. All right, so there you have it. Those are my thoughts on the mixing techniques that have absolutely saved my life, and in a lot of different cases, my music. Let me know your thoughts on this video. I'd be interested to hear what you got to say. I usually join a conversation within 48 hours of posting these videos, so I'd love to hear from you. And a conversation doesn't have to end there. We have a tremendous Discord community where there's a lot of like-minded DJs and producers at varying levels sharing production tips and plugins and other useful information for your journey. Much love and respect to you. Peace.